The day began in Washington. The last of many visitors paying respects were ushered from the Capitol Rotunda, the honor guard in step as President Reagan's casket was carried off. Nancy Reagan, her family, President Bush, former presidents, heads of state and family friends gathered at the Washington National Cathedral to say goodbye. Then, following his final trip to the streets of our nation's capital, President Reagan was off to his final resting place on the western edge of the nation he served and so loved. Good evening. I'm Chris Wallace here at the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, where over the next few hours we will see a final farewell to the nation's 40th president. Just a few moments ago, the presidential 747 jet carrying President Reagan's body flew here directly over, and you can see it right there in the mist, flying over the Presidential Library, tipped its wings, and headed on its way to the Point Mugu Naval Air Station, where it is due to land in just a few moments. As I say, for the next 3.5 hours, we'll take you every step of the way as the president lands for the last time in his beloved California. Then a motorcade will carry his body the 25 miles from Point Mugu here to the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley on an extraordinary ridge overlooking the California landscape, the Pacific Ocean shimmering in the distance. And for those of you who may wonder what's going to be different after all the ceremonies you have seen over the course of the last week, I can promise you tonight will be very different. It will be very personal, very emotional. For the first time, the president's 3 children, Ron, Patty, and Michael, will all speak publicly for the first time. And then perhaps the indelible image of this week when the flag that is draped over the president's casket is presented formally to the former First Lady Nancy Reagan, and she bids her beloved husband a final farewell. But we'd like to begin, if we could, with where this day began in Washington, D.C., where the nation's leaders, the world's leaders, celebrated the life and mourned the death of Ronald Reagan. So let's go now to Fox News White House correspondent Wendell Goler, who has our report.
America said farewell to its 40th president with a majestic tribute in story and song, praising Ronald Reagan for his courage and his optimism and his unshakable conviction that America is the light of the world. The moving ceremony at Washington's National Cathedral followed a tender scene at the Capitol, where the former president had lay in state for 2 days. Now, the crowd's gone, former First Lady Nancy Reagan seemed to say her own goodbye, with a few words and a gentle kiss. Inside the cathedral, some of the most powerful people in the world had gathered to pay their last respects. All 4 living ex-presidents, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton. Former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who watched the Iron Curtain fall 3 years after Reagan called for it. And Britain's Iron Lady, former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Reagan's ideological soulmate and strongest partner of the Cold War.
We have lost a great president, a great American, and a great man. And I have lost a dear friend.
Thatcher recorded her tribute more than a year ago after a series of strokes left her uncomfortable with speaking in public. It was Reagan's deepest wish that she attend the funeral, and against her doctor's advice, she insisted on making the trip to this country. Her presence next to Gorbachev recalled Reagan's greatest achievement.
Others hoped at best for an uneasy cohabitation with the Soviet Union. He won the Cold War, not only without firing a shot, but also by inviting enemies out of their fortress and turning them into friends.
More than one leader noted Reagan's gentle humor.
When asked, "How did your visit go with Bishop Tutu?" he replied, "So-so."
But the former vice president grew misty-eyed as he thought back upon the time before he was elected to the White House himself.
As his vice president for 8 years, I learned more from Ronald Reagan than from anyone I encountered in all my years of public life.
For Washington, the service ended 2 days of farewells, but for one person more than any other, a 10-year-long goodbye was coming to an end. A goodbye that had already begun when Reagan told the nation of his Alzheimer's in 1994.
America honors you, Nancy, for the loyalty and love You gave this man on a wonderful journey, and to that journey's end. Today, our whole nation grieves with you and your family.
Wendell Goler, White House correspondent for Fox News, reporting from Washington. As you can see, the 747, part of the presidential fleet that carried the president's body, former President Reagan's body, along with Mrs. Reagan, the Reagan family, and some of their closest friends, has just touched down at Point Mugu Naval Air Station in California. There are going to be a lot of bittersweet images today, and that's one of them. Obviously, this is the president's final trip here to California, but I can tell you it was one of his favorite places. He loved coming back to California, spent fully 1 year of his 8 years as president in California. And if anybody questioned that, he used to say, the president is never on vacation. The White House is wherever the president is. And as he traveled around the country, he would turn to his aides testily as the plane headed for California and say, now, finally, you have the plane headed in the right direction. And this time, of course, for the final time, Ronald Reagan making a trip back to his beloved and adopted home state of California. Fox News correspondent Adam Housley is out there at Point Mugu. I gather with quite a crowd, Adam.
That's right, Chris. The plane touched down 5 minutes early, in fact, and I just spoke with a Navy spokeswoman, and she said they had no idea how many people would show up here. In fact, I'm going to step away so you can get a look. Chris, they cordoned off an area, a white fence. When we came here about noon, there was nobody in there. They said we didn't know. They told me that we didn't know how many people would show up, Adam. We thought maybe 10, 15, potentially thousands. We really had no idea because there are so many civilian contractors that work out here. Well, take a look. They're estimating more than 2,500 people have come here to see the president, to pay their respects. The motorcade also, as we move to our right here, you'll notice the hearse and the motorcade eventually as well. The motorcade, more than 60 vehicles all told. The family, of course, being a part of that. The California Highway Patrol, which serves as our state police, as well as motorcycles. And then eventually off in the distance, you'll see the howitzer cannons. The Naval Air Base here wanted to have their own goodbye for President Reagan since he used this facility so many times coming and going. As you know, Chris, and others who covered the president, they will have a 21-gun howitzer salute here. There are also members of the USS Ronald Reagan who have been flown in to meet the president and to meet his family as well. That will all take place here momentarily. Chris, we should see Air Force One come around this hangar within the next 5 minutes or so, and then all the proceedings will take place. We'll also have the Marine Band here, of course, playing Hail to the Chief, among other notable songs. Chris?
Adam, thanks so much, and we'll be covering for the next few moments the arrival of President Reagan and the party that is accompanying his casket there at Point Mugu Naval Air Station. Let me bring in, we are lucky this evening, fortunate to have Richard Norton Smith as a guest with us. Mr. Smith was a director of the Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. He is now the director of the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. He loved California, didn't he?
Oh, he did. In fact, the people tell stories that when he was on Air Force One, he visibly relaxed as the plane neared California. He became almost a different man. And he did. He adored this place. Everything about Ronald Reagan looked to the west. Remember in 1981, he moved the inauguration from the east front of the Capitol to the west front of the Capitol. And that was not only because it could accommodate more people, but because, very symbolically, he was looking back to his origins. And it's going to be a very poignant evening, I think, tonight when that story comes full circle.
Yeah, one of the things that we don't know now, but I'm sure will come out in the course of the next few days, is what went on in that plane as they made their sentimental journey home from the nation's capital to California for the last time. Mrs. Reagan, the family, their very closest friends. And I think that's an important point that we want to make about what's special about tonight. The Reagans viewed the funeral in Washington today and all the events in Washington as a state ceremony, as an opportunity for the nation and the world to say goodbye to President Reagan. The Reagans, and I know you were involved in some of the planning for this, Richard, and I want to ask you about it, but the Reagans very much viewed what's going to happen tonight as much more personal. This was for the family. This was for their friends from California. We've seen some of them arriving from political people such as Governor Schwarzenegger, former governors Duke Majan and Wilson, movie stars from Bo Derek to Tom Selleck. They viewed this as a goodbye for their world. This is as personal as a former president and a former first lady can get a ceremony. There are going to be 700 invited guests here. Of course, the world is going to be watching. But by their standards, this is as personal, as intimate as they can make it. And in fact, they made a particular point of not I suppose they weren't rude about it, but basically telling President Bush, the former presidents, leaders from Washington, thank you so much for coming to the events in Washington, but please, you know, we'd like to keep this more low-key, more personal, more intimate tonight. They've come home. It's as simple as that. Washington was a place where Ronald Reagan made great history, but it wasn't home. This is home. This mountaintop became very, very special to the president and to Mrs. Reagan over the years. He did not get to enjoy his presidential library for too many years, but he enjoyed it immensely while he could. This is a very important part of his legacy. It is no accident that he decided to put his gravesite here, to spend eternity here, looking again off to the west, off to the Pacific, next to this building that houses much of his life and still more of his legacy. Now, we should say, and this plane is formally designated because the president is not on it. It is not Air Force One, although it's a plane that he regularly flies. It's known as SAM, Special Air Mission, but a member of the presidential fleet. We should say that inside that very large plane, there is one former world leader who wouldn't take no for an answer and who came along for the ride, and that, of course, is Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan's great and good friend, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who fought many of the battles, especially staying with him against some European allies who then, as now, did not always support the lead of the United States in facing down the Soviet Union at that time in the great battle about arms control. And she wasn't going to miss it. She got on that plane. Tell me about his relationship with Margaret Thatcher. Well, if you ever wondered why they called her the Iron Lady, you're not wondering after today, because, as you said, her doctors made it quite clear they didn't want her to come here, and she made it quite clear to her doctors that she was going to come here. She was unable to speak in the service this morning at the cathedral, but she had videotaped a very moving eulogy, and in fact probably all the more powerful because of the fact that she wasn't able to speak here. They had a unique relationship, there's no doubt about it. It preceded Ronald Reagan's coming to office. Remember, Margaret Thatcher became head of the Conservative Party in the mid-1970s. Ronald Reagan at that time was a former governor of California. Not a lot of people expected he would ever live in the White House. They hit it off from the very beginning, and they both rose like a rocket. Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister of Britain in 1979. The next year, President Reagan, of course, and they made history. They changed the world together. There is no doubt about that. We understand that as the plane is pulling up to its final spot there, that the crowd there at Point Mugu Naval Air Station is cheering. I have one good Maggie Thatcher story anecdote to tell. In 1983, I believe it was, Ronald Reagan was hosting the Economic Summit, and it switches each year. And just as this year it was in the United States, back in '83 it was in the United States at Williamsburg. And the host president would greet each member, each foreign leader as they arrived, and he had decided, he'd thought this out quite carefully, that as Maggie Thatcher arrived, he would say, you know, Madam Prime Minister, if your predecessors had been a little bit more skillful, you'd be hosting the summit instead of me, because, of course, we wouldn't have split from Great Britain. So in any case, she arrives, and he begins to tell the story, and he says, Madam Prime Minister, you know, if some of your predecessors had been a little more skillful, and she cuts him off and says, yes, I know, I'd be hosting the summit instead of you. He told the story on himself because I think he enjoyed that she could beat him, she could beat it a one-liner. You can see the crowd there. There is another story from a summit where the President Reagan apparently overheard in another room Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who was no political soulmate of his or Mrs. Thatcher, and he was berating Prime Minister Thatcher. And Reagan heard this from out in the hall, and he was shocked. And
he went in afterwards. Trudeau had left, and he was expressing his indignation to her, and she said, "Don't worry, Mr. President. Men can be very silly sometimes."
They apparently have shut down the engines of SAM 2800. Adam Housley, who is out there at Point Mugu, why don't you describe the scene? What's going on? We can see a very patriotic crowd, all of them waving flags.
Young crowd too. We're going to be talking quietly. They've asked us to keep our sounds down from the press risers, you might imagine. Very poignant this time. A very young crowd here. A lot of children here. A lot of families. People cheered when the plane first came around the corner of the to the tarmac, and then now it's kind of a quiet. A lot of flags everywhere. There are fire trucks with flags. Of course, there's security everywhere. Now, what will happen at this point is eventually the president's remains will be removed from the plane via this blue truck. It's the best way to describe it. That's what it will be brought down. So then the honor guard will take them from there over to the hearse. The family will be coming down as well. You'll notice some of the honor guard coming off the plane at this moment. There will also be a chaplain, Al Buckner, with the U.S. Army, will be giving, and Reverend Michael Wenning will be taking part as well. Eventually, the 3rd Marine Air Wing Band will be coming out too. We'll keep you updated as it happens, but at this point, you'll notice some of the honor guard coming off the plane, Chris.
Adam Housley at Point Mugu, thanks so much. Let's just look and listen as Ronald Reagan arrives on his home soil of California, his beloved home state, for the final time.
Yes, this gentleman on my left is going to take us to where we stand.
We're going straight in front of you, sir, straight to the general and Mrs. Regan. We'll go to their rear.
The rear of the family.
good place to stand. I'm not watching CNN. Move on the other side.
Watch out, a pan.
And so the final Reagan presidential motorcade heads off from Point Mugu Naval Air Base, heading off into the hills and up here into the Simi Valley to the ridge where he will be buried in a couple of hours. I will tell you that these events are running roughly 10 minutes ahead of time. And in planning for this evening, and I will tell you that the Reagan advance people who have all come back, the people who produced so many of the indelible moments, the indelible images of the Reagan White House, they have planned this entire evening down to the millisecond. The one X factor is this motorcade, because they're not quite sure how big the crowds will be and how quickly the motorcade will be able to proceed the 25 miles from Point Mugu up here to the Reagan Presidential Library. I will tell you that Mrs. Reagan, and the word that was used to me, is stunned at the public outpouring. Of course, President Reagan has been out of public view for 10 years now, and she is stunned at the reception she's gotten. You saw her there at the Point Mugu Naval Air Base as she left the 747 and waited for her the casket of her husband to be taken off the plane. She received a very heartwarming cheer, applause from the crowd. She acknowledged it. And I gather she is stunned, first of all, by just the attention, the embrace of the American people for her husband, and especially among young people, who really have no memory of having known Ronald Reagan as a president, for whom he is history, and that meant an enormous amount to her. We are joined now by Sheila Tate, who was the former press secretary to Nancy Reagan and was intimately involved in the planning for the events over this past week. First of all, Sheila, good evening. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Chris.
Let me ask you, in the course of the last few days, I'm sure you've talked to people in the Reagan party. I don't know if you had an opportunity to talk to the former First Lady herself. How have they felt about these events, as, well, among other things, the public response, and how's the First Lady holding up?
Well, I mean, I think I'll tell you a story. The staff who came back to help has been so incredible, and I think a lot of us feel like we've just been transported back in time for a day or two, and Ronald Reagan always got a great response from the citizenry when he went out and about the country. But today I was talking to Jim Kuhn, who was one of the old advance men, and he actually fell asleep standing in the Capitol Rotunda at 4:30 in the morning, the day that Ronald Reagan's body arrived. That's how hard these people have worked and how much they care about these events. I mean, Nancy Reagan is amazing. Today, I kept wondering how she was going to withstand the ceremony, and as she walked back down the aisle, I don't know if the cameras caught it or not, but she kept looking at people from side to, from one side of the aisle to the other, and mouthing the words, "Thank you." She was thanking people for being there, and it made me realize that Nancy Reagan's going to be fine. She's just going to be fine.
Well, those of us who know her know that and she's always been a little thing, and now, of course, with age, she sometimes looks quite frail. But we all know, Sheila, that I don't have to tell you, you worked for her for several years. She is strong as steel, and as you say, she's oftentimes always had the president's back, always looking out to make sure that there wasn't a staff member who had his own agenda. Always looking out for what she thought was his best interests, and I think you've seen that all this week. I mean, she has guarded him like a lioness.
Yes, she has, and her task is almost complete. She's done a wonderful job, and I suspect Ronald Reagan is very proud of her.
You were at the ceremony at the National Cathedral today. Give me your impression and the impression of the Reaganites whom you talked to about it.
Well, it was a magnificent funeral. I went back to my office and just spent some quiet time reflecting on what what the special moments to me were, and Margaret Thatcher is one of my special heroes of all times. Think about the fact that not only was she advised not to come, she came. She was here Wednesday. I don't know exactly when she got here, but she was here Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and now she's insisting on going out to the burial. She spent hours up at the Rotunda. She's just a phenomenal woman. I loved her story about President Reagan saying that what time he had left belonged to the big fella up there. I also loved the moment when George H.W. Bush began to lose his composure and then recovered it, because I was also his press secretary in 1988 during the campaign, and he told me that after he was elected, but before he took office, one day he said, one of the things I most admire about Ronald Reagan is his ability to handle his emotions at these really highly charged emotional events like the Challenger explosion and when he would greet the grieving families from the Marines killed in Lebanon. And he said, my greatest fear is that I'm going to break down. And I saw him today begin to break down and rise to the occasion. So he did learn something from Ronald Reagan. There were a lot of things, a lot of things that I loved. I loved President Bush's speech. I mean, there was so much in it. Everybody kept saying all the speeches were wonderful, each in their own way. The event, the music was magnificent. The crowds outside were wonderful. And even the rain, you know, there's something about a rainy day funeral that always seems fitting.
Sheila Tate, former press secretary to Nancy Reagan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this evening.
You're welcome.
Well, it may have been raining in Washington, but as you can see, it is another day in paradise in Southern California, and this, of course, is the weather that Ronald Reagan loves so much. You can see the motorcade proceeding quite slowly on the road, the 25 miles up from the Pacific Ocean up here into the hills of the Simi Valley. Anita Vogel is along the motorcade route. Anita, tell us what you see.
Well, you know, Chris, I think one of the things that is so striking as we stand out here is you see people really from all walks of life. There are children here, there are adults, there are senior citizens, there are people who vividly remember Ronald Reagan when he was president during his years in office. And then, of course, there are children who have no memory of Ronald Reagan because they weren't born until well after he left office. I think parents brought their children here because they want them to have a real sense of history. They want them to have something they can relate to and identify with when they learn about Ronald Reagan in history class. And you know, we're really in the middle of a residential neighborhood here, just a few miles away from the library. And so really this has become sort of a family event. Now, when we arrived out here about 7 hours ago, there wasn't anybody here. Of course, this is a completely different scene out here now. There are hundreds of people. And I want to introduce to you someone who we found was the first person that we saw out here. He came out here about 5 hours ago to mark a spot to get a good seat. This is Eric Phillips. He is a Los Angeles City firefighter. Eric, you were the first person I saw out here. Why was it so important to come out? And I know you brought your wife and your little children as well.
Right. Well, it's a historic day. This will not happen again here in this community. And of course, just wanted to bring the family out here. The boys are 10 years old. They weren't alive when President Reagan was here. And obviously it's a big community event. We have a lot of family and friends here. So we just want to be a part of it, show respect to the Reagan family, and be a part of this great event.
What are you hoping that I know you have twin boys, what are you hoping that they'll take away from this? What do you hope they'll remember?
Remember the, I guess the pageantry of it and the honoring of our president in the highest office, whether it be Democrat or Republican. It just shows nationally who we are, and internationally, of course, worldwide, who we are and how we respect a person who has voted into office here in the United States.
Okay, Eric Phillips, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Yep. And I think many people here feel the same way as Eric. And Chris, we're just obviously maybe getting very close to the time when the motorcade will pass. I can tell you people are getting their cameras ready. They're getting towards the edge of the street here so they can get a good view. So we'll send it back to you.
Anita, thanks so much, and we'll be back to you as the motorcade comes past you. Trace Gallagher of Fox News is about 200 yards away from me at the actual site of tonight's ceremony and very close to where President Reagan will be laid to rest. Trace, describe the scene for us there, if you will.
Well, I can tell you, Chris, they are now readying the ceremony. The people are taking their seats behind us. We're expecting about 720 people. We, of course, have seen former governors Pete Wilson and George Deukmejian and the current governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, Maria Shriver. I have not seen them walk in yet, but they, of course, are here and are scheduled to be sitting down at any moment now. The military band is already playing. They played a solo of Amazing Grace. You see there the burial place where Ronald Reagan will be laid to rest. They'll bring the casket in, and it will, of course, go by that slab. There is Mickey Rooney, by the way. We have seen a number of celebrities here, along with Bo Derek and Tom Selleck. The slab of the Berlin Wall, the casket will be carried by that. We have heard all week long as the military band begins playing again behind me. All week long how it was hammers and jackhammers that brought down the Berlin Wall, that President Reagan really did strike the heaviest blow. His casket will, of course, be set near the gravesite. And what we're looking toward, one of the most poignant moments, I think, of maybe the whole week is when Captain James Simons, who is the commander of the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, will take that American flag, folded ever so carefully military style, and then on one knee as the sun sets over the Pacific, will present it to Nancy Reagan. And you have to wonder at that point in time what will go through the former First Lady's mind, because that is kind of the finality of it. That is when, after a week of mourning, the nation shared with her that she really will have to grieve herself and her family. We're expecting a much more intimate affair tonight than we have over the course of the week. The Reagan children, Ron, Michael, Patty Davis, they will all speak, and we are expecting some very poignant messages from them. I think it's important to point out that when the former president is interred, we will not see that. What will happen is, at the end of the ceremony, which we expect to last about an hour and 30 minutes, the sun, by the way, will set at 7:15 West Coast time. And after an hour and 30-minute ceremony, all of the guests will be once again allowed to pass by the casket after the flag has been given, and then they'll bring a tent out which will sit over the actual burial site, and the interment will not happen until much later tonight, possibly even tomorrow morning, Chris. So the actual interment of former President Reagan will not be seen. It will be, we understand, if the Reagan family wants to be there, they can be, but we're not even sure they'll be on hand for the actual casket being laid into the crypt. Chris.
Trace Gallagher, thanks so much. I can tell you it is an extremely eclectic group that Mrs. Reagan has invited to this event, from California political leaders, as we've said, Governor Schwarzenegger, former Republican governors Wilson and Deukmejian, to such sports figures as Tommy Lasorda, the former manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers, Wayne Gretzky I saw coming in, the former great hockey player, and then an assortment of people from television and movies. Robert Loggia, the actor I saw there just a moment ago, Mickey Rooney, Bo Derek, Tom Selleck. Some of older Hollywood was supposed to come, people like Charlton Heston, Kirk Douglas, but they've had a lot of physical problems in recent years and apparently were unable to make it here to the funeral. Let's just take in the scene here. This is the extraordinary site where tonight's ceremony will take place. Behind the Reagan Library, as you can see, the landscape of California that reminded Ronald Reagan so much of his favorite place on earth, Rancho del Cielo, the ranch in the sky, the ranch that he spent so much time in before and during his presidency, just up the coast here a little bit north of Santa Barbara, and off in the distance, the Pacific Ocean. That is the site where Ronald Reagan will be laid to rest. That catafalque there is where his casket will be set and where the flag will be taken off and presented to Mrs. Reagan that Trace was just talking about. Let's listen, if we can, to some of the music that is being played for the guests here as they wait for the Reagan party to arrive. You can see the motorcade proceeding the 25 miles from Point Mugu up, rising up from the Pacific coastline up here into the hills, the beautiful hills of the Simi Valley and the Presidential Library, the spot that Ronald and Nancy Reagan chose for their library and where they would be laid to rest. Britt Hume, Washington managing editor of Fox News, has been anchoring our coverage all day from Washington. Britt, your thoughts about this day and the events in Washington that you saw?
Well, I must tell you, Chris, that when the former President Reagan died last Saturday, I had an early thought that perhaps we in the news media, knowing him as we did and being as preoccupied as those of us, especially those of us here in Washington, are with politics and so on, that we might be in some danger of overdoing the story because he had been gone as president for 15 years, gone from our public view for another 10 years, hadn't really seen him since for a decade, that people may have lost sight of him in a way, and to some extent that the interest in him might have been diminished by that. Boy, was I wrong. As these events have built this week, it appears that interest in Ronald Reagan has been rekindled in many people. People seem to have been deeply moved by the pageantry of these events so carefully planned by Mrs. Reagan and the Reagan family. And I think that many people have been reintroduced to Ronald Reagan, and many people perhaps have been introduced to him. You know, you've heard observer after observer who have come out to stand by these parade routes and appear at the edges of these events say that they brought their children. Many of them, if not most of them, too young to have remembered President Ronald Reagan, read about him perhaps in history books or heard about him. And yet they seem to have been, I mean, the pictures of the little children in the Capitol Rotunda as we saw them with their parents were quite striking. The children seemed in awe. Obviously, that's a magnificent place, the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, and that's obviously a very striking setting to enter. But I've had the sense here that whether by design or not, and as you've noted, Chris, we've been told that Nancy Reagan has been quite struck by it. This event, the death of this man and our remembrances of him seem to have stirred a very deep chord in this country, and it remains to be seen how long the spirit that it has engendered for at least a week in this divided city, this very political and divided city, will last. But it is certainly something to behold as long as it has gone on this week.
I'm curious, Britt, because of course we reporters have opinions about everything. Why do you think it is? Why do you think that after so many years off the stage, Ronald Reagan has struck that chord, and even among young people who had no firsthand experience with him?
Well, a couple of things obviously come to mind, Chris. Is his achievements, which were argued over at the time and immediately after he left office, seem to have come into kind of clear relief now. There really isn't a lot of serious controversy about whether Ronald Reagan's actions precipitated the end of the Cold War, and the policies and the ideas that he held and the belief that he held that we needed to be the winners, that we and our Western allies needed to be the winners in the Cold War and could be. People now see that for what it was and what it meant. Of course, you remember when Ronald Reagan left office, Mikhail Gorbachev was in power. The Soviet Union, while it had made efforts and concessions and a conciliatory atmosphere had been created, was still competing on the world stage for the allegiance of many nations. And I remember I covered the first President Bush, and in the early months of this administration, he did a long review of American foreign policy across the board, during which time Mikhail Gorbachev was acting like the Colossus of Europe, and he was making disarmament proposals one after another and being applauded in European capitals and to some extent as well in the United States. And people were wondering whether this President Bush would ever regain the momentum. He did, of course, by making even bolder disarmament proposals than Mr. Gorbachev had. And of course, he presided over the actual falling of the Berlin Wall, but we could all begin to see then that these were events set in motion by the Reagan administration, of which, of course, President Bush had been a part. But I think people have come to recognize the achievements, come to appreciate also that genial spirit of his. You know, I think of those two pictures that they're on the covers. It's the same picture on the cover of both Time and Newsweek this week. This unimaginably likable guy he was, and such an American character. There he has on the cowboy hat with that unmistakable grin of his, and he's a pretty compelling figure, seen in retrospect, as he was at the time. And I think that people have just had their interest in him rekindled, and their memories of him, of course, they're so fond, and the criticism that might have come from some quarters has been muted at most, or at least, and so I think that's contributed to this celebration of Ronald Reagan's life. And of course, we have sympathy as well for the family, for Mrs. Reagan. Those of us who might not have known have learned what an extraordinarily intense marriage it was, and how deeply devoted she was to him, and what a role she played in the planning of all these events, and have sensed her loss, and perhaps felt her loss as well. And so, as citizens of this country, so you put that combination together, and those are sort of my best estimates of what might have been the ingredients of this outpouring.
We should just remind viewers that what we're looking at here is the Reagan motorcade making its way the 25-plus miles from Point Mugu up to the Reagan Presidential Library. And you can see it is a 25-mile trip that they're going to take. Nice-sized crowds. They're lining the roads on both sides, and they're certainly not in one of the more populated areas that they will get to as they get closer here to the library. Britt, I know you, like I, have been to an awful lot of formal events in Washington. What struck you about the ceremony today, the national funeral at Washington National Cathedral?
Well, of course, Chris, as you and I know, we journalists hear a lot of speeches, and we become sort of aficionados of political oratory. Is that Johnny Mathis?
I tell you, this is one of the more peculiar sets of people. We've seen Wayne Newton, Johnny Mathis. There are people here, I have to say, and I spent a lot of time, there's Tom Selleck, I spent a lot of time with Ronald Reagan that I am genuinely surprised we're invited to this event. But obviously, because it's a very, very small group of people, these were all people that meant something to the president and Mrs. Reagan. But yes, go ahead about speeches. It was Johnny Mathis.
Yeah, it wasn't Johnny Mathis indeed, a voice I haven't heard except on videotape for a very long time. He, of course, was a very popular singer when I was a boy. I was just going to say, Chris, that we were all sitting here wondering how each of these national and international figures whose eulogies were part of this ceremony today were going to do. We always appreciate a speech well written and a speech well delivered, and I thought we heard 4 very good ones today. Margaret Thatcher spoke with that sort of force and conviction of hers. It was touching in a sense too, Chris, that she's now, because of the stroke she's had, really unable to do any public speaking, and it was difficult enough for her to get here and to get there. As I know she's part of the party that traveled to the coast, and she had obviously taken some pains to make this tribute to him a year ago and put it on tape. And I think all of us who were sitting here in Washington watching thought it was pretty much the Margaret Thatcher that we remembered, a woman of enormous force and conviction, and it came through. I thought Brian Mulrooney's fond recollections of the former president were of great interest. Former President Bush, the sincerity of his feelings for Ronald Reagan, evidence as his voice began to break as he was describing his personal relationship with him and what he said he learned from him. And I thought President Bush, who is not noted as a speaker, as a natural speaker. You see former California Governor Pete Wilson, one of the successors to Ronald Reagan as governor of California there. I thought that this was one of his better efforts, and it recalled to some of us who remember the cathedral service that was held in the aftermath of 9/11, just 3 days after, on September 14th, when the president gave what many people thought was a very powerful speech. It reminded us to some extent of that as well. So the quality of the speaking, as we say, we thought was pretty good, and it was a very moving service. And I was particularly struck, Chris, I must say, by the rendition that they gave in this service of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which of course is, the words to that anthem are triumphant. They're full of triumph and glory. And we'd heard it 2 nights earlier when the president's casket was being carried up into the Capitol, and it was played over and over again by the military band there, and it was played very slowly and with a dirge-like, almost mournful tone. And here we heard it, especially at the end of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, played with all of the zest and sense of triumph that is embodied in that song. And it was, I thought, very powerful and very moving indeed.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say I thought the speeches were excellent, and I, as you, was particularly struck by the speech by former President Bush, and especially, I suppose in a way, it felt more heartfelt than any of the others. His emotion more on display, and you knew he didn't want to do it because it was something that he used to talk to former President Reagan about, and very much admired, was Reagan's ability to control his emotions in highly charged moments. And there he was, almost losing it. And as Sheila Tate said a moment ago, she thought that President Reagan would have been proud how he got himself under control as he was talking about the fact that he had learned more from Ronald Reagan than he had from any other person in public life. And then, as you, the Battle Hymn of the Republic and that soaring music and that beautiful Gothic church, the National Cathedral, you know, we sometimes take it for granted, those of us who live in Washington. I often think to myself, I live fairly close to it, and I often think if it were in France or Italy or something, we'd all drive 400 miles to go see it, and yet there it is, this really soaring, beautiful cathedral in our backyard.
Yes, and of course it sits, as you know, Chris, on the highest point in the city of Washington, Mount St. Alban. I happen to have been one of the many people in this town who went to that school there that is the National Cathedral School for Boys, where a couple of the first President Bush's sons went. George W. Bush did not go there. Al Gore went there. Senator John Warner went there. John Kerry briefly went there. And of course, what I remember from my boyhood about that church was that it was not complete. It took many years, many decades, really, for that church to be finally completed, as it was not too many years ago. And I also remember it very well as a place where the seats were a little hard. We had to go over there for services many times. And I remember those chairs they had in there in those days were kind of hard. And the one thing you didn't want to have to do was to kneel on that hard floor there. But I'm sure the experience of those who were there today will be something they'll never forget. I might add about former President Bush, the first President Bush. When I was covering him in 1980, during the primary season, when he was, of course, running against Ronald Reagan, I asked him at one point if he knew. It was just the two of us having a conversation on his campaign plan, and I said, you know, do you know Ronald Reagan? And he said no, that he really didn't know Ronald Reagan, and he barely knew him at all. And so you see the progress that relationship underwent. You know, he had the first President Bush, who was then Ambassador Bush, that was the highest title he'd had. He'd been Ambassador to the United Nations for a period of time, and he hung in there during a primary season which Ronald Reagan won easily, but he hung in until the end and all the way into the convention, and he had won the Michigan and Pennsylvania primaries late and had a very strong showing in Texas, which was, of course, a place where Ronald Reagan was very powerful, and got himself on the ticket. And then they came to be quite close when he was vice president. Ronald Reagan, as we know, wasn't very close to a great many people, although he had many friendly acquaintances, many of whom we see tonight. But the relationship with them became quite strong, and you saw evidence of that in the former president's emotional reaction today.
You know, I'll tell you, Britt, I think one of the things that brought the two of them together is that they used to have a private lunch once a week, every week, in a small private dining room just off the Oval Office. Boyden Gray, very close to former President Bush, and in fact his White House counsel, was telling me that as in the day or two running up to the lunch, that the vice president, then George Bush, would go around to all of his top aides and say, do you know some jokes? Because sort of the price of admission spending any time with Ronald Reagan is you had to have a couple of good stories. He very much wanted to hear them and very much enjoyed them, and so he would get the jokes. But I think the thing that really cemented their relationship was the fact that there was never, and I covered the last 6 years of the Reagan presidency, there was never a single leak, there was never a single inch of distance between Vice President Bush and President Reagan. There was never a sense that Vice President Bush was looking to his political future, and obviously he was looking to what happened in 1988, running and winning the presidency, but there was never a sense that he was looking out for his political agenda at the expense of Ronald Reagan's, and I think that that loyalty was very important, not only to the president, but Mrs. Reagan and to the entire Reagan team.
You know, President Bush has been described by some people as a man who didn't really have deep political principles. I won't argue that point now, but he certainly is a man who has very deep personal principles. And he has a sense of what a gentleman should do and what a gentleman should not do and what is proper conduct. Your recollection of President Reagan's trust in him based on the fact that he was no leaker is a part of that, and we can also remember as well that he thought it would be ungenerous and inappropriate for him to comment on his successor, President Clinton, and he never did. He was very disciplined about that, and of course we've seen that that principle has not always been followed. There's, of course, the governor and his wife, Maria Shriver, arriving there at the ceremonies to be seated. I must say, I wonder if Mrs. Reagan is not by now simply exhausted, or whether perhaps she has been to some degree energized and stirred by what she's seen this past week.
My guess is you're right on both counts, Brett. I'm sure that in some sense she's exhausted, but you can just see her, as you see with so many politicians, taking nourishment from the crowd. You know, and it's a very special, I think the applause, to me, has been more moving than if it were cheers or anything else. It's almost like the applause at the end of a play, a job well done. And there seems to be this sense of appreciation for the job that President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan did over the course of their public service, and now Mrs. Reagan, of course, in the last 10 years in protecting and speaking out on behalf of her husband. But you know, as I was saying talking a few moments ago with Sheila Tate, for this frail woman, and sometimes she looks like she could be blown away by the stiff wind here at the top of this ridge in the Simi Valley, she is strong as steel. I don't have a doubt in the world that she will get through this ceremony beautifully, with grace, with dignity, if for no other reason than she knows that's what Ronald Reagan would want of her and expect of her, and she would never want to disappoint him.
Chris, I'm very much looking forward to these events tonight, because we will at last hear from the Reagan children. And it has been remarked upon that their marriage was one of such intensity, and they seemed so utterly content in each other's company and didn't need other people around to fill out a room with them, that it will be interesting to hear them speak and to hear them share their feelings about their father. It has been a family relationship which some have described as troubled at times and distant among some of the members. It was remarked upon here in Washington, Chris, that when the family came into the rotunda, Mrs. Reagan, of course, was on the front row there and accompanied her husband's casket as it came into the Capitol Rotunda for the lying in state, that Ron, son Ron, and daughter Patty did not accompany her on that phase of it, although they were in the rotunda, and son Michael, who has been a very vigorous and energetic defender of his father, was a couple of rows back, which struck some people as peculiar. We will hear from them all, won't we?
We will indeed, and I think it's only honest to say that it has been something of a soap opera, the relationship in the first family during a lot of the Reagan years in the White House. Patty Davis, their somewhat rebellious daughter, was quite estranged. As we know, of course, she got very involved in the nuclear freeze movement, brought one of the leaders of the movement, Helen Caldicott, to the White House, and arranged a meeting with the president that by all accounts did not go well at all. Two people who were not going to change their minds, Ronald Reagan and Helen Caldicott, about whether it made sense to put medium-range missiles in Europe in the early 80s. They had a very strained relationship for a long time. Patty even wrote kind of a tell-all book, a fictional book about a governor and a first lady, which was not all that nice. And it really does seem, that relationship seems to have been repaired. Patty seems to have come back in the fold, especially since her father got sick. And I think that before he really suffered the full effects of Alzheimer's, that she had a reconciliation with her father and also with her mother. You see, she's been the one very much at her mother's side. Ron, who was very much her mom's darling in the White House, I think has had some problems in recent years, but he seems very close. And Michael, as you say, has had his ups and downs. I suppose, you know, to some degree, but played out in a public spotlight that most of us don't have to put up with. It is the story of every American family that has its ups and downs, but I'm sure one of the gifts that they have given their mother and in memory of their father is that the Reagan clan is joining together at this week, and it's really quite moving. I think, frankly, for those of us who've known the soap opera that was playing out behind the scenes over the years, to see them all together as one, I know how much it must mean to Nancy Reagan, and I know how much it means to former President Reagan.
Chris, are those the strains of Ferris, Lord Jesus, we're hearing in the background there? Quite lovely.
It does sound that, and it looks like we're very close to the... I've got Richard Norton Smith here. It looks like we're very close now to the library. Am I correct?
I was talking to a friend who was out there earlier today who said that these crowds began forming by 12:30 this afternoon. You know, I have to tell you, the popular verdict on Ronald Reagan is being delivered all this week. The historical verdict is always somewhat more problematic. But Reagan, as usual, had a very healthy attitude about such things. Inside this library, in the replica of the Oval Office, is the president's desk, and on it is the original sign on his desk. And everyone knows Harry Truman kept a sign that said, "The buck stops here." And not many people know Ronald Reagan kept an equally revealing sign on his desk, and it said that there is no limit to what a man can accomplish if he doesn't care who gets the credit. He was once asked what he thought about history's verdict on his presidency, and he said, "Heck, I don't care, I'll be dead." And characteristically blunt and commonsensical. There's also the wonderful story following the INF Treaty. Mikhail Gorbachev was getting lots and lots of headlines. In fact, he was getting most of the credit in journalistic accounts. And some aides to the president expressed their unhappiness with that fact. And Reagan said, "I don't mind. Heck, I co-starred with Errol Flynn once."
So he knew about sharing headlines and sharing billing. I'm told now that the Reagan motorcade is still about 15 to 20 minutes away. Why don't we switch back to Trace Gallagher, who is, as I say, a couple of hundred yards away from me at the actual site where the ceremony will take place tonight. Trace, you've seen an eclectic group of people coming there today.
Yeah, we certainly have, Chris, and we should notify you that they had just notified us that once the motorcade gets to the bottom of Presidential Drive, then we will no longer be allowed to speak for the remainder of the ceremony, which we anticipate from that point will be about an hour and 45 minutes or so. You just pointed out, as did Britt, that Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger walked in here along with his wife Maria, and it might be important to note that they sat next to former Governor Pete Wilson. We also expect former Governor George Deukmejian to be here. Of course, Pete Wilson kind of fell out of grace in California politics in recent years, and then because of the resurgence of Schwarzenegger and Arnold bringing him back onto his campaign, has now got renewed popularity. We keep showing again and again the burial site, Chris, that where the president will be laid to rest. And just to let people know, there's a quote on the burial site that says, "I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and there is purpose and worth to each and every life." And yes, there is a very eclectic crowd here as we watch the motorcade progress down towards Simi Valley. We have seen Wayne Newton, we have seen Johnny Mathis, we have seen many celebrities who were not expected to be here. And we should note, yes, Chris.
Just let me interrupt for a moment, because we're seeing quite an extraordinary sight there. Apparently the presidential motorcade, the former presidential motorcade, is on the 101, and as you can see, the other side of it, the reverse side of it, is a parking lot. People have just stopped their cars, gotten out, and they are taking pictures or just looking on as Ronald Reagan makes his final trip across the California landscape. This is really an extraordinary scene. You could also see cars that had just stopped on the overpasses. Traffic stopped, and people looking down as the motorcade passed beneath them. And just one more expression. Look at that. I mean, here's a busy road at 5:45 on a Friday afternoon in the heart of rush hour in California, and nobody's in a rush to go anywhere.
Yeah, and isn't it amazing that as you look at these pictures, we are on these freeways
You know, I have to say, this is really quite remarkable. Richard Norton Smith is here looking at these pictures with me. 15 years after Ronald Reagan's presidency, 10 years after he basically went off, retired from the public stage. Look at this, a busy freeway just shut down as people have stopped their cars, no honking, no distress, no road rage, people just paying their respects as the presidential hearse makes its way up the 101. And again, it's a Friday night in the middle of rush hour. I'm sure people are on their cell phones calling their wives saying, honey, I'm going to be home late for dinner, but it's worth it.
Hold the dinner. History is happening.
Exactly. Exactly. You know, we talked about it a little bit with Britt. As we look at these pictures, Richard, your thoughts as to why Ronald Reagan still has this kind of a hold on the American public?
Well, Ronald Reagan broke all the rules. You know, there really was no one else like him. He was arguably the most unconventional political leader of our time, in part because I think he didn't seem like just another politician. He was a conviction politician. He was a man who went into public life relatively late in life. He was 55 years old when he was elected governor of California for the first time in 1966. And even people who disagreed with his ideas, disputed his convictions, argued over his policies, felt in their gut that he went into public life for the right reason, because he had ideas, because he had convictions. It wasn't about personalities. He didn't need an office to gratify his ego or to complete his self. He was, in a sense, driven, but he was driven for all the right reasons. And I think that added to his credibility. They thought the Reagan presidency was about big things, as indeed it was. They also formed a bond with this man, I think beginning in March of 1981, the day that he was almost assassinated. We saw him then in a way that we very rarely see public figures. All of the spin doctoring, all of the message, all of the communications panoply of the modern White House stripped away. One man lying in a hospital bed, really confronting his own mortality and joking about it, reassuring the nation. I think a lot of people began to reconsider what they thought about Ronald Reagan on that day, and all the history that followed really only confirmed it. And you said it is the paradox. This man who has been largely invisible for 15 years, and yet with every year that's passed, he seems to loom larger and larger on the historical landscape. It's not nostalgia that people feel this week. I think that trivializes what you're seeing. It's an abiding, enduring admiration for what this man represents and for the America and the vision of America that he articulated perhaps better than anyone, certainly anyone in his generation.
You know, and I think, Richard, that we should point out that it is not just after the fact. I mean, people felt this way about him when he was president. A really remarkable statistic that I had never heard put together until I was reading it on the plane out here yesterday. Reagan ran for president in 2 elections, 1980, 1984. The total, he received 1,014 electoral votes. Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale received 62.
And the day he left office, after 8 years of a job that frankly usually wears people out and erodes their popularity, he went out of office with a 63% favorable rating, which is the highest in the history of modern opinion polling.
Well, as we continue to watch these remarkable pictures of Ronald Reagan's casket making its way up the highway, the 25-mile journey to the Reagan Library and his final resting place, let me throw it back now to Britt Hume, our Washington managing editor in Washington.
Chris, thank you very much. As we've been noting, it has been a remarkable day here in Washington, which began fairly early with the procession from the Capitol Rotunda out onto the west front of the Capitol, and then on through Washington and up to the cathedral for the ceremony, the national funeral, which lasted, what, an hour, almost, I guess, an hour and 45 minutes. And during that time, my colleagues here in Washington, Fred Barnes, executive editor of the Weekly Standard, was here, so was Mort Kondracki. executive editor of Roll Call, Michael Barone, Fox News contributor, senior editor at the U.S. News, was up at the service and was in the service. Michael, let me begin with you as we approach the moment when this procession up the Highway 101 in California reaches Simi Valley. Your thoughts about today's events?
Well, I think this is the day that Ronald Reagan is stepping into history. Up at the cathedral today, they had a beautiful service. Quite wonderful music. You've noted the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Just all the music seems to have been selected and performed in a beautiful way. But it really, all four of the eulogy speeches gave us a chance to look back on the presidency of this man. We're at a vantage point now where we're 25 years away from when Ronald Reagan began his successful campaign for the presidency back in 1979. And so we can put some historic perspective into what the situation was that confronted him when he became president and what he did as president. And it seems that though he's received the scorn of the chattering classes, certainly he did while he was in his office, and still does in some cases, it's pretty clear that he had major accomplishments. In 1979 and 1980, totalitarian regimes were on the march. The U.S. seemed helpless to stop them. With Ronald Reagan's policies in place, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Freedom and liberty extended to a wide area of the world. Those are pretty big events. You have to chatter a lot to see that in a different way, other than as a successful.
You have to chatter to the point where you're not listening, right?
Well, you have to do what George Orwell once said of some intellectuals' theories. He said, you have to be awfully smart to believe something that's stupid.
What, Kondracki?
Yes, it's amazing to go to read some of the critiques that bitter critiques by various talking heads about Ronald Reagan, about how stupid he was and how ill-informed he was, and now when you consider all the accomplishments of that of his presidency, winning the Cold War, advancing the cause of democracy in many places around the world, democracy took a great leap forward. It wasn't just human rights, as Jimmy Carter expressed it. It was actual changes in the way people are governed, and permanent changes in South Korea and the Philippines and country after country. And the other major thing that I've always appreciated when I was covering Ronald Reagan was the total change in America's morale about whether a president could succeed. I mean, before, when Jimmy Carter left office, there were people who were writing articles in learned journals saying that it was impossible for the American presidency to accomplish what it was designed to do, and that perhaps what we needed was a quasi-parliamentary system in this country. We should consider constitutional change and so on. And Ronald Reagan completely turned that around and proved that the presidency was more than viable, but could get done what it needed to get done. So I completely agree with Richard Norton Smith that this is not an exercise in nostalgia. This is an exercise in respect.
You know, it is true, Fred, that Ronald Reagan didn't think there was much wrong with America. He didn't think there was much wrong with the American system, and he didn't think there was much wrong with the world that more freedom wouldn't take care of.
More freedom and less government. You know, I've been struck all day at these events in Washington and now out in California. The wide variety of friendships that Ronald Reagan had. And I think the explanation is that he had 3 careers. Obviously, he was an actor, and he was always very proud of his acting career, though he's generally been called a B actor. In other words, he wasn't Laurence Olivier or Clark Gable or a top star, but he was very proud of his career. Then he had sort of a business career, where he toured the country giving speeches for General Electric, and got to know many, many people in the business community. And then finally he had a political career where he knows all these Republicans and elected officials and so on. And they're all represented. Even in California, they're all represented. People from the Hollywood community, people from the business community, and they're the widows in particular of some of the businessmen in California who first urged him to run for governor in 1966, because most of the business leaders themselves have died. And then they're all the Republicans, the people that helped Reagan get elected, and the people who worked for him in his administration. It's a huge group of friends, and they're all represented. It's very unusual to have that many different types of friends, I think, for any American, even one as prominent as Ronald Reagan.
And they seem to have been in concentric circles around him and Nancy.
Yeah.
But in the innermost circle, there seem always only to have been the two of them, doesn't
You know, I wonder what it's going to be fascinating to see Monday and so on what the European press is saying about Ronald Reagan now. Back when he was president, first president, he, like George Bush, was called a cowboy and all the rest. This week, The Economist, which doesn't necessarily represent all of Europe.
Look at that crowd, Mort, by the way, is that on that bridge overpass, as we just saw, people 3 or 4 or 5 deep there watching this moment as he rolls across the landscape there in California.
Just to complete the thought, the Economist has on its cover Ronald Reagan, the man who beat communism. I mean, the flat statement, no questions about it, no dispute.
Mikhail Gorbachev and his reviews notwithstanding, right.
Yeah. I was struck, Britt, today by, there was brief mention of one parallel that I would make more of, and that's the parallels between Ronald Reagan and the man he voted for president 4 times, Franklin D. Roosevelt. I mean, they both became president when people had given up on the American economy. And they both, as presidents, faced totalitarian regimes on the march, with the United States seeming helpless to stop them. And they succeeded in overcoming both those problems.
And overcoming a national sense of discouragement. Grave morale problems faced Roosevelt. Nothing as grave faced Reagan, but a serious problem nonetheless.
Well, Roosevelt, like Reagan, believed that this was a special and unique country. He believed in what's called American exceptionalism, with a special mission to spread freedom and liberty throughout the world. There's not continuity on all their economic policies, but there is that major continuity of attitude and on foreign policy.
In just a moment, we're going to pause here to allow our Fox News affiliated stations around the country to join our coverage. And as we watch, and we are not really able to hear, we have no control of what we can hear from, these are a group of cameras and microphones. This is Fox News coverage of the farewell to President Ronald Reagan. You're looking at the motorcade containing the casket of the former president as it makes its way to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. I'm Britt Hume, along with the Fox News team. There you see the site there at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, where this casket will be placed when it arrives there. And there, of course, that statue of Ronald Reagan in what looks like a flight jacket there, and with the familiar smile on his face that was spoken of so often today and in the recent days here in Washington and in California. This will be the night on which we hear from President Reagan's family members, who have been present through all the observances in recent days, but have so far not been heard from. That is the scene where this service will unfold tonight. The guests are gathered and have been gathering for some time. This is very much a California audience tonight. The governor is there. Former Governor Wilson is there. There you see Governor Schwarzenegger, his wife Maria Shriver. These people have been gathering here for some time now. A number of very well-known figures from the entertainment world, Hollywood, gathered there as well. On the scene out there is my colleague and friend Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday, who is at the site, at the library. Chris?
Well, Britt, as you can see, these beautiful pictures, and this is just the way the Reagans planned it. If the Washington ceremony earlier today was an opportunity for the nation and the world to say goodbye to Ronald Reagan, this today is the opportunity for the family and for their California friends to say goodbye to Ronald Reagan. It has been very carefully and specifically personally planned over the years by the former president and by Mrs. Reagan, and is really an opportunity for them to give their final farewell. You can see the band playing for the guests, the motorcade, a couple of moments late now. It's the first time all day that they've been behind schedule, but obviously held up by the huge crowds along the way that have been paying attention, obviously wanting to pay honor to the president, the first lady, the former presidential party, as they make their way up here to the Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. Let's listen, if we can, for a moment to the military band and singing group that is playing music for the guests as they wait for the former First Lady and President Reagan's casket to arrive.
When times get rough and friends just can't be found, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me
You can see that the motorcade and the hearse carrying the body of Ronald Reagan has made its way now off the 101, is on one of the smaller roads, and is getting much closer to the Reagan Presidential Library. I'm here with Richard Norton Smith, who was a former director of the Presidential Library and Museum here, and now is the director of the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. Tell me about the Reagans' involvement in choosing this extraordinary site for their, not only for their presidential library, but also for their final resting place.
Well, I think that's the key. They were inseparable. Where the library was going to be, so was the resting place. The original site was, incongruously enough, supposed to be Stanford University, which frankly never made a whole lot of sense. Palo Alto not exactly being Reagan country. The faculty wasn't happy, and in the end, the library was moved, and it turned out to be Simi Valley's gain, and I think probably the Reagans' gain. They came to this site, they looked out at the Pacific from this mountaintop, and it reminded them of a ranch, and that more than anything else, I think, is why they decided to put the library here and put the gravesite next to it.
Well, that is a sight that would have warmed the heart of Ronald Reagan, to see a couple of people here on the Simi Valley landscape out for a ride. He would have said to them, forget the motorcade, go out and enjoy your ride. Let's, if we can, go back to the site of the ceremony at the Reagan Presidential Library, where the U.S. Air Force Band of the Golden West is now playing music for the 700-some guests who are there waiting for the Reagan party to arrive. Yes. But I'm hearing... You can see the presidential motorcade. I keep saying the presidential motorcade out of habit. The motorcade of former President Ronald Reagan. Small crowds there now on the lining the street as he approaches the Reagan Presidential Library. As we showed you those pictures of the of where the ceremony is going to take place on the back veranda, if you will, of the library, there's an expression in movie making called the golden hour, which is the last hour or 2 hours before the sun sets, when the sun casts a kind of golden light. And the two movie makers, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, who had specifically chosen this time of day for this ceremony, for this event, you can see it is just bathed in that golden light. This is the view from behind the Reagan Presidential Library. It looks out on this just magnificent California landscape. Ronald Reagan said it reminded him of his favorite place on earth, which was his ranch. Just up the road here, a piece north of Santa Barbara, Rancho del Cielo. I hope I'm not doing too much of an injustice to that. Ranch in the sky. And it was also a place where he made movies. He made westerns in this area, and so that meant a lot to him. But Richard Norton Smith, I think it also had a symbolic importance to him and to Mrs. Reagan, did it not?
It did. This is the city on a hill. The metaphor that he used throughout his career. And also remember, he jokingly once compared political life to show business. He said, you need a great start, great opening, then you coast for a while, then you need a great finish. Tonight he has a great finish.
Well, I'm not sure he ever coasted.
No.
he led a very full... That's one of the extraordinary things when you think to his life. I mean, here is a man who ran for president in 1976 against the incumbent Jerry Ford and was beaten at age 65. Well, you know, that's you quit, you retire, you go back to your ranch, you enjoy yourself. Not a bit. I mean, he campaigned on for 4 more years, was elected as the oldest president at age 69, served until he was almost 78, just a month before his 78th birthday, and accomplished all the great things that we talk about in the 8th decade of his life. It really is an amazing American story.
But remember again, it wasn't conventional ambition that drove this man, ideas, convictions. Going back to his earliest days in Dixon, Illinois, his mother Nellie gave him a lifelong conviction, her conviction, that God had a plan for every life, and whatever happened in life was part of that plan. And I think it steeled him for all of the difficulties of a political life, and it drove him on in the face of much of that was conventional wisdom. And it helps to explain in a small way some of this outpouring that we're seeing tonight all along the highways of Southern California.
Now, as we get closer to the library, you can see the crowds beginning to build up. And this has got to be so heartening to Nancy Reagan. You can hear the crowd starting to applaud as she passes by. And she must draw real strength from this, the sense that her Ronnie, which is what she always called him, that her Ronnie still strikes such a chord with the American people. Look at the crowds here. You can see 3, 4, 5 people deep, all of them waving American flags. This is really something.
This is Reagan country. I mean, America is Reagan country.
I was going to say, today, I think all of America, from coast
so. But
to shining coast, is Reagan country.
This was Reagan country first and last.
I that shine at night. Do not stand at my grave and cry.
The Reagan motorcade continues to get closer to the presidential library here, where the final ceremony and the burial will take place. Britt Hume back in Washington. Your thoughts as you watch the president make his way up into the hills?
Well, obviously, Chris, we're all going to be eager to hear from the members of the Reagan family who have been omnipresent this week for the observances here in Washington, and even the early observances out there in California, but we haven't heard from them, and it will be interesting to hear from them.
Ladies and gentlemen, upon conclusion of the service, please remain in place until Mrs. Reagan departs, after which you will be escorted.
The motorcade continues. We're told that it's about, and this, I don't know that any of us are going to believe any of these forecasts now, about 5 to 7 minutes away from arriving at the Reagan Library. And I can tell you that because of the big crowds here, that it is was supposed to arrive at exactly 6 p.m. on the East Coast, 9 o'clock, or rather 6 p.m. on the West Coast, 9 p.m. Eastern time. So it's about getting on to 20 minutes late in its arrival here, but I'm sure nobody in the motorcade is upset, because I'm sure they're heartened by what you're seeing right there, these crowds that have come out spontaneously to pay final tribute to their president. I have to tell you, Richard Norton Smith, as we watch these, I just can't get over the public appeal. I mean, some of it obviously as he's arriving, you know, people are looking, but you just from one end of the coast to America, when you heard the stories of people that had to wait 14 hours to get here into the library, 8 hours in traffic jams, 3 or 4 hours to get on a shuttle bus, to spend 3 or 4 minutes inside the lobby, the vestibule of the library here to see the former president's casket. This has not been a small investment of time or energy by hundreds of thousands of people. They have made a great effort to pay their final respects to Ronald Reagan.
I can testify to that personally. I was one of the 104,000 people who stood in line outside the Capitol in Washington, in my case for about 5.5 hours on Wednesday night, and I was struck by the diversity of the crowd. People had come from all over the country. Lots of young people, lots of people who were certainly too young to have ever voted for Ronald Reagan. Families with children in strollers, military people in uniform.
Let's just listen to the crowd here as they respond to the presidential hearse as it passes. You know, you have to think that Ronald Reagan would have loved this scene. He loved small-town America. I was just thinking back to, I believe it was in the 1984 campaign when he was running for re-election, and he took a train ride, you know, shades of Harry Truman, across Illinois, and stopping in small towns and making speeches from the back of the bus. In fact, I think they even got Harry Truman's railroad car, and he loved small-town America. He obviously was a product of it himself, and he used to talk about American bravery and heroism and say, where do we find such people? And he would then say, we find them in America. They come from our small towns. They are born, bred, raised with American values. And if America is celebrating Ronald Reagan, I think part of it is because he celebrated America. He believed in the American spirit. You know, we're talking about things that Ronald Reagan loved, and I will tell you one thing he loved. He loved the military. One thing he liked, he enjoyed saluting, and everywhere he went, he used to love to salute members of the armed forces and to see them salute him back. But it obviously went much deeper than that. During the course of his 8 years, we lost some men. I know that when the Marine barracks was bombed in Beirut, and they had a ceremony back in, I believe it was Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I'll never forget this, a driving rainstorm, and usually Reagan weather was so good, but that day it wasn't. Maybe it was appropriate that it was a driving rainstorm, and they stayed there in the pouring rain, he and Nancy, and personally consoled the families, it seemed, of hundreds of soldiers who had lost their lives. He really felt very deeply and personally his role as commander-in-chief. We can tell you that the Reagan motorcade is now on the property of the Reagan Presidential Library, making its way up the long driveway to the crest of the hill, to the Reagan Presidential Library, and to Ronald Reagan's final resting place. The motorcade delayed by the unusual outpouring, the big crowds that have greeted him along the way, but he is finally almost home. This is the spot that Ronald and Nancy Reagan chose for their library and also for their final resting spot. The two came together. And as you look out across the scenery here tonight, you can't imagine a spot that would have meant more to this president. Let's watch as the ceremony unfolds. The Reagan party is getting ready to come out. They are now in the area, this lobby of the Presidential Library, which is where the president's casket lay in repose for more than a day, and more than 100,000 Californians came to see it. That, incidentally, if you're wondering what that slab of concrete is there, that is a chunk of the Berlin Wall, and the president's casket will be brought directly past it. Of course, Ronald Reagan played a large part in part of the Berlin Wall, being in Simi Valley, California. I remember in June of 1987 when he made that challenge to Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down that wall. A lot of us in the press thought it was a great speech and didn't have much chance of happening. One more occasion when Ronald Reagan knew a lot more than the rest of us about what was going to happen. I believe that as the president's casket is brought out, if they stay according to the program, that they're going to play Ruffles and Flourishes and Hail to the Chief, and that will be the last time that it is ever played for Ronald Reagan. I will tell you that he very much enjoyed that honor. In fact, when he and Mrs. Reagan used to arrive at various events and they played Hail to the Chief, he would lean over to Nancy and say, "Honey, they're playing our song." Tonight they play it for the last time for the President Reagan.
Chris, it's
Brett Hume in Washington. Your thoughts as you see these
I just wanted
really
to,
quite moving images.
And just one quick note here before the family comes back out. As they entered the library there, we saw them pass once again that Reagan statue outside, and I had said earlier it looked like a flight jacket he had on. It is, of course, as a number of email correspondents have properly reminded me, that is, of course, Ronald Reagan in a denim jacket of the kind which he was so fond of wearing, and a cowboy hat in his hand. So just for the record, that's what you saw as they passed.
Here you can see the president's children and their families coming out. Ron Reagan, his wife Doria, and Patty in front. Michael Reagan and his wife Colleen right behind them. And someone you may have been wondering about, the very tall man there on the right, is Dennis Revelle. Dennis Revelle was married to the president's oldest child, Maureen Reagan, who died of cancer in 2001. And Mrs. Reagan has invited Dennis Revelle and his new fiancée, and they have been a part of the Reagan party this entire week. They were here when the casket was first brought up to the Presidential Library. They made the trip to Washington, and now, of course, here for the burial. A very nice gesture by Mrs. Reagan. And of course, as we have mentioned, what is going to be very special about this event is that we will hear from the three Reagan children, the first time in this long week that they will have spoken in public. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan's casket will be taken to its final resting spot. Mrs. Reagan presented with the flag that is draped over his casket, and then she will give her beloved husband a final farewell. There you can see Margaret Thatcher behind the former First Family, and she seems to have borne up remarkably well. In fact, the warm, sunny California weather seems to be agreeing with her. She looks much better and haler than she did when she was in Washington. And looks like she's seated directly next to Arnold and Schwarzenegger and California First Lady Maria Shriver. As I say, this event is about as personal as an event can be when you have 700+ people in the eyes of the world watching. This was the event that the Reagans wanted for the family, for their California friends. And they wanted it to be in that spot that you see, that extraordinary location on a crest of a hill overlooking the California mountains, and off in the distance on a clear day, you can see the shimmering of the Pacific Ocean. They are somewhat behind schedule, as I mentioned, but they had built some wiggle room into the schedule, so they should be able to get this ceremony in before the sun sets. And here is the Presidential Honor Guard and the casket being brought out.
One left. 8. Forward. March.
Please pray with me. Eternal and Almighty God, we began this day, and it seemed the heavens were weeping as we paid our farewell to your servant, Ronald Reagan. We eulogized him. We worshipped under the arches of that stately cathedral. We have come from sea to shining sea, to this soil which he loved so much, and where his body will remain. Gracious Lord God, turn our tears of sorrow into the hope of the resurrection. Comfort our hearts, and especially the Reagan family and the nation, for we celebrate his life, and we do it through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Good evening. I'm Mike Regan. You knew my father as governor, as president, but I knew him as dad. I want to tell you a little bit about my dad, a little bit about Cameron and Ashley's grandfather, because not a whole lot is ever spoken about that side of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan adopted me into his family in 1945. I was the chosen one. I was the lucky one. In all of his years, he never mentioned that I was adopted, either behind my back or in front of me. I was his son, Michael Edward Reagan. When his families grew to be two families, he didn't walk away from the one to go to the other, but he became a father to both, to Patty and then Ronnie, but always to Maureen, my sister, and myself. We look forward to those Saturday mornings when he would pick us up, sitting on the curb on Beverly Glen as his car would turn the corner from Sunset Boulevard, and we would get in and ride to the ranch and play games, and he would always make sure it ended up a tie. We would swim and we would ride horses, or we'd just watch him cut firewood. We would be in awe of our father. As years went by and I became older and found a woman I would marry, Colleen, he sent me a letter about marriage and how important it was to be faithful to the woman you love. With a P.S., you'll never get in trouble if you say I love you at least once a day. And I'm sure he told Nancy every day, I love you, as I tell Colleen. He also sent letters to his grandchildren. He wasn't able to be the grandfather that many of you are able to be because of the job that he had. And so he would write letters. He sent one letter to Cameron, said, Cameron, some guy got $10,000 for my signature. Maybe this letter will help you pay for your college education. And then he signed it, Grandpa, P.S., your grandpa is the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. He just signed his sign. Those are the kinds of things my father did. At the early onset of Alzheimer's disease, my father and I would tell each other we loved each other and we'd give each other a hug. As the years went by and he could no longer verbalize my name, he recognized me as the man who hugged him. And so when I would walk into the house, he would be there in his chair, opening up his arms for that hug, hello, and the hug goodbye. It was a blessing truly brought on by God. We had wonderful blessings of that nature. Wonderful, wonderful blessings that my father gave to me each and every day of my life. I was so proud to have the Reagan name and to be Ronald Reagan's son. What a great honor. He gave me a lot of gifts as a child. Gave me a horse, gave me a car, gave me a lot of things. But there's a gift he gave me that I think is wonderful for every father to give every son. Last Saturday, when my father opened his eyes for the last time and visualized Nancy and gave her such a wonderful, wonderful gift, when he closed his eyes, that's when I realized the gift that he gave to me. The gift that he was going to be with his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. He had back in 1988 on a flight from Washington, D.C. to Point Mugu told me about his love of God, his love of Christ as his Savior. I didn't know then what it all meant, but I certainly know now. I can't think of a better gift for a father to give a son. And I hope to honor my father by giving my son Cameron and my daughter Ashley that very same gift he gave to me, knowing where he is this very moment, this very day, that he is in heaven. And I can only promise my father this: Dad, when I go, I will go to heaven too. And you and I, and my sister Maureen that went before us, we will dance with the heavenly host of angels before the presence of God. We will do it, melanoma and Alzheimer's free. Thank you for letting me share. My father, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Many years ago, my father decided to write down his reflections about death, specifically his own, and how he would want people to feel about it. He chose to write down the first verse of an Alfred Lord Tennyson poem, Crossing the Bar, and then he decided to add a couple of lines of his own. I don't think Tennyson will mind. In fact, they've probably already discussed it by now. Tennyson wrote, "Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea." My father added, "We have God's promise that I have gone on to a better world where there is no pain or sorrow. Bring comfort to those who may mourn my going." My father never feared death. He never saw it as an ending. When I was a child, he took me out into a field at our ranch after one of the Malibu fires had swept through. I was very small and the field looked huge and lifeless, but he bent down and showed me how tiny new green shoots were peeking up out of the ashes just weeks after the fire had come through. "You see," he said, "new life always comes out of death. It looks like nothing could ever grow in this field again, but things do." He was the one who generously offered funeral services for my goldfish on the morning of its demise. We went out into the garden and we dug a tiny grave with a teaspoon, and he took 2 twigs and lashed them together with twine and formed a cross as a marker for the grave. And then he gave a beautiful eulogy. He told me that my fish was swimming in the clear blue waters in heaven, and he would never tire, and he would never get hungry, and he would never be in any danger. And he could swim as far and wide as he wanted, and he never had to stop because the river went on forever. He was free. When we went back inside and I looked at my remaining goldfish in their aquarium with their pink plastic castle and their colored rocks, I suggested that perhaps we should kill the others so they could also go to that clear blue river and be free. He then took more time out of his morning, I'm sure he actually did have other things to do that day, and patiently explained to me that in God's time, the other fish would go there as well. In God's time, we would all be taken home. And even though it sometimes seemed a mystery, we were just asked to trust that God's time was right and wise. I don't know why Alzheimer's was allowed to steal so much of my father, before releasing him into the arms of death. But I know that at his last moment, when he opened his eyes that had not opened for many, many days, and looked at my mother, he showed us that neither disease nor death can conquer love. He may have, in his lifetime, come across a small book called Peace of Mind by Joshua Loth Liebman. If he did, I think he would have been struck by these lines. "Then for each one of us, the moment comes when the great nurse, death, takes man, the child, by the hand and quietly says, 'It's time to go home. Night is coming. It is your bedtime, child of earth.'"
He is home now. He is free. In his final letter to the American people, Dad wrote, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. This evening, he has arrived. History will record his worth as a leader. We here have long since measured his worth as a man. Honest, compassionate, graceful, brave. He was the most plainly decent man you could ever hope to meet. He used to say, 'A gentleman always does the kind thing.' And he was a gentleman in the truest sense of the word, a gentle man. Big as he was, he never tried to make anyone feel small. Powerful as he became, he never took advantage of those who were weaker. Strength, he believed, was never more admirable than when it was applied with restraint. Shopkeeper, doorman, king or queen, it made no difference. Dad treated everyone with the same unfailing courtesy, acknowledging the innate dignity in us all. The idea that all people are created equal was more than mere words on a page. It was how he lived his life. And he lived a good, long life. The kind of life good men lead. But I guess I'm just telling you things you already know. Here's something you may not know. Little Ronald Reagan trivia for you. His entire life, Dad had an inordinate fondness for earlobes. Even as a boy, back in Dixon, Illinois, hanging out on a street corner with his friends, they knew that if they were standing next to Dutch, sooner or later, he was going to reach over and grab a hold of their lobe, give it a workup. There, sitting on his lap watching TV as a kid, same story. He'd have a hold of my earlobe. I'm surprised I have any lobes left after all of that. And you didn't have to be a kid to enjoy that sort of treatment. Serving in the Screen Actors Guild with his great friend, William Holden, the actor, best man at his wedding. Well, Bill got used to it. They'd be there at the meetings, and Dad would have a hold of his earlobe. There they'd be, some tense labor negotiation, two big Hollywood movie stars, hand in earlobe. He was, as you know, a famously optimistic man. Sometimes such optimism leads you to see the world as you wish it were, as opposed to how it really is. At a certain point in his presidency, Dad decided he was going to revive the thumbs-up gesture. So he went all over the country, of course, giving everybody the thumbs up. Dory and I found ourselves in the presidential limousine one day, returning from some big event. My mother was there, and Dad was, of course, thumbs-upping the crowd along the way. And suddenly, looming in the window on his side of the car was this snarling face. This fellow was reviving an entirely different hand gesture and hoisted an entirely different digit in our direction. Dad saw this and, without missing a beat, turned to us and said, "You see, I think it's catching on." Dad was also a deeply, unabashedly religious man. But he never made the fatal mistake of so many politicians, wearing his faith on his sleeve to gain political advantage. True, after he was shot and nearly killed early in his presidency, he came to believe that God had spared him in order that he might do good. But he accepted that as a responsibility, not a mandate. And there is a profound difference. Humble as he was, he never would have assumed a free pass to heaven, but in his heart of hearts, I suspect he felt he would be welcome there. And so he is home. He is free. Those of us who knew him well will have no trouble imagining his paradise. Golden fields will spread beneath the blue dome of a western sky. Live oaks will shadow the rolling hillsides. And someplace, flowing from years long past, a river will wind towards the sea. Across those fields, he will ride a gray mare he calls Nancy D. They will sail over jumps he has built with his own hands. He will let the river carry him over the shining stones. He will rest in the shade of the trees. Our cares are no longer his. We meet him now only in memory, but we will join him soon enough, all of us, when we are home, when we are free.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Time. Bears, hold. Ready, step. March time. Bears, hold. Center, stay. There, down. Bear. Up. On left. Up. Hold. There. Down.
Hold. 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 Right. Push.
Mrs. Regan, members of the Regan family, distinguished and honored guests, it is a wonderful, awesome responsibility for me to be able to give these final parting words on this long journey of this week of sadness. I want to thank you for the privilege of being your pastor and chaplain to the President. Little did I think that 4.5 decades ago, when Frida and I came to this country to study in college, that one day I would end up as the chaplain to the President of the United States, only in America. Dear Nancy, thank you for bearing your grief so nobly. Thank you for the dignity that you have shown this week. Our hearts have gone out to you. So many people have commented on the picture where you and I are together as we began this week. And I think the reason for its poignancy was that the whole American nation was putting its arm around you. And so we love you and care for you. Thank you for caring for the President in his declining years. Thank you for the wonderful example of your marriage that you modeled throughout your life together, and especially in the White House years. Yours was truly a glorious friendship based on mutual love and respect, and we love you for it, and thank you for it. To you, Michael, and Patty, and Ron, thank you for those very, very touching and moving words. A little humor, but the heartfelt love of children who love their father and respect him so much. We gathered at the beginning of this long day in the National Cathedral and heard so many wonderful words from the nation's leaders and also from a beloved friend. I have never heard Lady Margaret Thatcher speak more eloquently in all her life. The last time when I heard her speak, I had the privilege of being present as she was awarded the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award. And I remember her saying particularly, when Ronnie spoke about the Soviet Union as the evil empire, even I blanched. Thank God that neither she nor your husband shirked in the face of communism, but saw its demise. He touched us all. When I went back to the land where I was born in South Africa, I went to see my aging father. And as I sat in his study, he pointed to a huge picture behind me framed. It was of your husband. And he said, "This is my president." 10,000 miles away, he identified, as we all do and shall do through time to come. It now remains for me to talk about the man and his faith. Indeed, he was a gift from God to us all. He made us feel good and confident about ourselves, about our country, and about our future. And I believe it's because he gained his confidence from the psalm which I read at the beginning of this week, Psalm 46, where the psalmist says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in the time of trouble. When you attended church, so many people noticed that he could sing the hymns without looking at the hymnal. He loved hymns. And it was appropriate that it was sung in the cathedral this morning and played on the bagpipes this evening. That hymn speaks about God's amazing grace. And Ronald Reagan knew of the grace of his Lord Jesus Christ, for he lived with and on and in that grace. I think of that one particular stanza of that hymn which says, "Through many dangers, toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Grace has led him home this day. He was a man who exhibited graciousness with all that he met, from the highest in the land to the lowliest. On one occasion, when Alzheimer's was beginning to rob that beautiful mind, and he no longer came to Bel-Air Presbyterian Church, you know that I came to the office regularly and brought the church to him and then to your home. And on one occasion, his secretary said, "Mr. President, your pastor is here. Come and sit in the corner of his office." And he said, "No, I think I'll just sit here at the desk." I looked at her, she looked at me. We knew he wasn't going to budge. So I sidled up and sat on the edge of the desk, and I said, "Mr. President, you're still boss. I'll sit where you are." And so I read scripture and prayed. Shortly afterwards, his secretary ushered in my wife, and he stood up immediately and went over to her and shook her hand. You see, the gentleness, the kindness, the love, the gifts, the fruit of the Holy Spirit was deeply embedded in his DNA. As Ron has already said, in 1994, he wrote that letter saying, "I now begin my journey into the sunset of my life." But I believe that last Saturday, he began a new journey into the glorious presence of Almighty God. And he is basking in the sunshine of his love. And I believe he's touching the face of God, as he said during the Challenger disaster. And the Lord is saying to him, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." Let me close with just one thought. In the ancient nation of Israel, when the temple had been built, the Lord appeared to King Solomon and said to him these words, "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and turn from their wicked ways and pray and seek my face, I will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land." God was reminding his ancient people that the glory of the nation was not in power or prestige, in wealth or in might. Ronald Reagan knew that as a cardinal truth, that ultimately our strength is not in our might, but it is as we depend upon Almighty God and trust in him and walk humbly before God. Ronald Reagan lived and believed that, and thank God that he did. Mr. President, I salute you.
Thank you.
Gun 3, stand by. Fire! Gun 4, stand by. Fire!
Please pray with me. Now, eternal God, we commend into your hands the spirit of your servant, Ronald Wilson Reagan. We commend him into your care and keeping, and as we do so, we commit ourselves afresh into your love and care. Teach us to so live that we shall never, ever be afraid of death, nor ever ashamed to see you face to face, but grant that your love and peace may rest with us now and always. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and grant you his peace, now and forevermore. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Late is better than early. Spin it.
Stand by. Ready. Ready. Aim. Fire. Ready. Aim. Fire. Ready. Aim. Fire. Ready. Freeze and boom.
A little over a minute, guys. About minute 10.
All right. Ready. Forward. March.
what do you say after a ceremony like this? A ceremony that Ronald and Nancy Reagan personally organized that really said it all. The only thing I can think to say is that what we saw today, regardless of what you think of the politics, the policies of Ronald Reagan, is that we saw a celebration today of a great man. In Washington, they celebrated a man who changed the nation and changed the world, and here tonight, they celebrated a father and a husband, the eloquent tributes of 3 children, the grief of a devoted wife. It was a celebration of a great man. I've been in this long day's journey in tonight with Richard Norton Smith. Richard, your thoughts?
The ancient Greek dramatist Sophocles wrote, "One must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been." This, it is safe to say, is evening in America.
Don't you think, in its own way, very different set of experiences, very different images, that this will be as iconic as the Kennedy funeral?
Oh, I think without a doubt. What more can you say? I mean, than the sight of Margaret Thatcher bowing at the gravesite of her great friend and ally and history maker.
That, of course, the grief-stricken ceremony of a man cut down in youth, and this, of course, a celebration of the fullness of a life, all that a long life can accomplish. And that image of Nancy Reagan in her private and her public grief over the casket of her devoted husband, I think, is an image that all of us will take and strikes at our very core. And I think that Ronald Reagan, it was the ceremony that he helped organize, and it's the ceremony he would have wanted. That's the story here from Simi Valley, California. Now back to Britt Hume, my good friend and colleague in Washington.
Chris, thank you very much. We have nothing to add from here. Thank you, those of you who watched, for joining us tonight for the farewell to President Ronald Reagan. From my colleague Chris Wallace and the rest of the Fox News team, I'm Britt Hume in Washington. We'll leave you now with some of the images and sounds from this week of remembrance of Ronald Reagan.
To President Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan helped make our country and this world a better place to live.
With the lever of American patriotism, he lifted up the world. And so today, the world mourns the passing of the great liberator.
Resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, Though he were dead, yet shall he live.
I learned more from Ronald Reagan than from anyone I encountered in all my years of public life. I learned kindness. We all did. I also learned courage. The nation did.
When the sun sets tonight off the coast of California, and we lay to rest our 40th president, a great American story will close. May God bless Ronald Reagan and the country he loved.
This has been a Fox News special presentation.